The sea was supposed to protect them. Instead, it betrayed them. The Sea Peoples, the invasion that ended the Bronze Age. Imagine standing on a Mediterranean shore around 1200 BCE. The horizon is calm. The markets are busy. Trade ships unload copper and wine. Then, smoke rises from a distant village. Rumors spread of strangers with weapons no one recognizes, voices no one understands, ships shaped unlike any seen before. The Egyptian pharaoh Merneptah will be the first to name them in stone, but in truth, by then it is already too late. Entire coastlines whisper of their presence, of cities falling before sails appear, of temples burned before their gods can be invoked. One clay tablet, written in desperation by King Hatti of Ugarit, survives to this day. His words plead for help against an enemy approaching by sea. But history is silent on the reply, for the very empire he begged to was already ash. And here lies the terror. No one knew where these people came from, nor how many they were. Were they an army? A migration? A storm of humanity set loose across the seas? Stay with me, because this is not just the story of raiders on the horizon. This is the story of how an entire, interconnected world, the height of Bronze Age civilization, was snuffed out within a single human lifetime.
Empires rise. Empires fall. Most are forgotten until someone chooses to remember. But here's the truth. 85% of people who watch these stories never subscribe. They vanish, just like the civilizations we're uncovering. You're still here. That means you care about more than names and dates. You care about the voices buried in ruins, the choices that shaped centuries. And the next chapter? It's darker, stranger, and it carries a twist no historian saw coming. Don't just watch history, be part of it. Subscribe now, because when the next revelation drops, you'll want to be here when it's written.
It began with sails on the horizon, silent, unfamiliar, without crest or king's banner. The harbors of the eastern Mediterranean had seen merchants, envoys, and fleets for centuries. But these ships carried neither gifts nor greetings, only the shadow of something unnamed. Around 1200 BCE, the kingdoms of the late Bronze Age reached dazzling heights. Pharaohs in Egypt inscribed their victories in stone. The Hittite kings in Anatolia commanded vassals from the Black Sea to Syria, and in the Aegean, the Mycenaean palaces ruled with storerooms of gold and amphorae of oil. Trade wove them together, tin from the east, copper from Cyprus, cedar from Lebanon, wine from Crete. To walk through Ugarit's harbor was to see the world in miniature. To its people, this order must have seemed eternal. But permanence is a human illusion. Behind the splendor, warning signs crept in. Drought bit into Anatolia. Hittite kings diverted grain from Syria just to feed their courts. Egyptian scribes recorded Nile floods too low to nourish the fields. In Ugarit, a surviving tablet pleads, "There is famine in my house. If you do not send grain, we will die." These words, pressed into wet clay by an anonymous scribe, speak not of triumph, but of desperation. They are reminders that the palaces were not fortresses against nature. One bad season could ripple across empires. Then came the first sightings. Patrols reported unknown ships slipping along the coast of Anatolia. At first, they were dismissed as raiders, the kind that plagued ports for centuries. But something felt different. A letter from Ugarit cuts off mid-sentence. Enemy ships already here. The stylus never finished the thought. Archaeologists found that clay tablet hardened by the very fire that destroyed the city. The ink of the apocalypse is not blood, but unfinished words. That silence where the rest of the sentence should be may be the most chilling testimony of the entire Bronze Age. Who were they? Refugees from famine? Dispossessed warriors? Exiled clans cast adrift until desperation turned them into destroyers? The Egyptians would one day call them the Sea Peoples, but to those who first saw the black shapes on the horizon, they were something worse than enemies. They were unknown. And what came next would turn the illusion of permanence into the reality of fire. The late Bronze Age world was bound together by invisible threads: trade, treaties, royal marriages. But threads fray before they snap. From the coastal city of Ugarit, in today's Syria, we find clay tablets, written in cuneiform, that read less like government records and more like panic-stricken text messages. One king pleads, "The enemy ships are here. Where are you? Our fields burn. Our harvest is taken. Send help." The tablet was baked hard in fire, not by scribes, but by the flames that consumed the city itself.
It wasn't only Ugarit. Shipments of copper from Cyprus arrive late, or not at all. Egyptian records speak of northerners cutting off the grain routes. In Hatti, the Hittite kings complain of famines they cannot feed, even as their once mighty armies grow restless. And yet the strangest part? No one names the enemy. Not in the Hittite annals, not in the Ugaritic letters. Only in Egypt do scribes dare call them by a title that sounds less like a nation and more like a curse: the Sea Peoples. But who were they? A coalition of ruthless conquerors? Starving migrants with nothing left to lose? Or perhaps something far more unsettling? Victims of the very same collapse they are accused of causing. Ships clash on the Nile Delta, their high wooden prows locked like beasts in combat. Archers rain arrows, javelins pierce the waves, and chaos spreads across the water. This is not modern cinema. It is Ramses III's account, carved in stone at Medinet Habu. For 3,000 years, those walls have shouted his triumph. Egypt saved from annihilation by foreign invaders, the so-called Sea Peoples. But look closely. The detail is unnerving. Ramses III orders the sculptors to record every fragment of battle: hulls, oars, headdresses of enemies. Never before had Egyptian kings obsessed over such granular military scenes. Why? Because this wasn't a casual victory. This was survival on the knife's edge. Behind the stone, Egypt's reality was fragile. Papyrus records speak of strikes among workers at Deir el-Medina, the world's first known labor strike, because rations of grain were delayed. Famine crept even into the Nile Valley, a place normally immune to starvation. The treasury was bleeding from wars abroad and unrest at home. Ramses III may have stopped the invaders at Egypt's frontier, but he couldn't stop Egypt from rotting inside. His inscriptions are not only about victory, they are monuments to fear. If Egypt survived by the skin of its teeth, what of the other great powers who had no Nile to shield them? Far to the north, in the Anatolian highlands, another king faced the storm: Suppiluliuma II, the last ruler of the Hittite Empire. His empire was vast, stretching from the Black Sea to Syria, but by 1200 BCE it was already brittle. Drought shriveled crops.
fracturing provinces rebelled, and the Hittites, land warriors by tradition, built fleets to fight at sea. Suppiluliuma II boasts of victories against Alatia, modern Cyprus. But these inscriptions ring hollow. Why would the Hittites, who ruled landlocked mountains, suddenly gamble everything on sea battles? Because Cyprus was the source of copper, and without copper there was no bronze. Archaeology shows the desperation. Grain imports from Egypt vanish in the records. Tree ring data shows decades of aridity, and internal rebellions cut Hatti to pieces. Then, the silence. Hattusa is burned. The royal archives, once the largest collection of tablets in the world, are reduced to shards. Entire libraries of treaties, prayers, and royal decrees gone in days.
When archaeologists dug the ruins, they noticed something strange. No heaps of corpses, no mass graves. The city was emptied before the flames. Did its people scatter into the mountains? Did they join the very invaders who consumed the Mediterranean? The end of Hatti remains a riddle carved in ash. One empire scarred but alive, another obliterated overnight. But these were not the only players. Across the Mediterranean, kingdoms like Mycenae, Ugarit, and Canaan waited for a storm they could neither predict nor escape. And when the fire reached them, the world would change forever. On the Aegean shores, the palaces of Greece once stood as citadels of power. Mycenae with its lion gate, Tiryns with its towering walls, Pylos overlooking the western sea. For centuries, these palaces weren't just royal homes, they were command centers, the beating hearts of redistributive economies. Every jar of oil, every fleece of wool, every weapon forged in bronze was recorded on clay.
The script was Linear B, an early form of Greek. It is here, in these final, fragile tablets, that we glimpse the last words of the Mycenaean world. Unlike most records, lists of sheep or oil rations, one set stands out: orders to station watchers of the coast. Why? No detail is given, only that rowers and guards must be readied. The sea had turned from lifeline to threat. And then the writing stops. The tablets were preserved not because they were stored, but because fire hardened the clay. These final archives exist because catastrophe struck. Archaeology adds further whispers. At Pylos, the palace was destroyed in a sudden blaze, yet in storerooms, jars stand upright, still filled with grain and oil. People fled so quickly they left food untouched. At Tiryns, fortification walls were hastily repaired, suggesting enemies were expected. At Thebes, layers of ash cover smashed tablets and toppled walls. Each center falls, not all at once, but like dominoes across the Aegean. And still, patterns unsettle us. There are no great hoards of gold buried in panic, no mass graves to tell of singular battles. Instead, scattered skeletons, abandoned homes, silent shrines. The palaces fell, but the villages around them endured. Power collapsed, but people remain. Why? Scholars offer multiple causes. Drought, revealed by microscopic pollen in lake cores, shows failed harvests lasting decades. Earthquakes left scars in Mycenaean walls. Trade routes collapsed after Ugarit and Hatti fell without copper and tin. Bronze itself grew scarce. Some argue for internal revolt, the palace elite demanding too much, while warriors and peasants seized their chance. And through it all, raiders, maybe even the sea peoples, struck vulnerable coasts. But here lies a truth rarely spoken. Collapse is not uniform. Some places adapted. Refugees fled. Mycenaean pottery appears in Cyprus and coastal Anatolia in the very decades Greece fell silent. Warrior graves increase, showing power shifting from palatial bureaucrats to local warlords. Oral traditions lingered, growing into tales of kings and wars, the seedbed of the Homeric epics. The last Linear B tablet may record an order for coast watchers, but the next voices in Greek are Homer's, sung centuries later in a world of iron. The line is not straight, but the echo is unmistakable. So as Greece burned, a paradox emerged. Palaces vanished, writing was forgotten, economies collapsed, yet memory survived. The ruins of Mycenae became the stage for myth. The ashes of Pylos gave birth to poetry. But this was no local tragedy. The same fire was spreading across Anatolia, Syria, and beyond. Which begs the question, when an entire world collapses at once, what rises in its place? The year is around 1150 BCE. Across the Near East, palaces lie in ruin. The great cities of the Hittite Empire are silent. Their archives turn to dust. Yet here, in Cilicia, something stirs, a rebirth that feels more like a warning than a promise. The city is Tarsus, once a proud satellite of the Hittite kings. Archaeologists expected to find palatial halls, frescoed courts, the trappings of power. Instead, they unearthed fortresses, walls sloped outward, gates angled to trap attackers, foundations gouged deep into the bedrock. These are not monuments to kingship, they are scars turned to stone. What is most striking is what is absent. No vast bronze smelting complexes, no warehouses for imported tin. The lifeblood of the Bronze Age long-distance trade is gone. What emerges, instead, is iron. At first, it is crude, brittle, unreliable, a poor cousin to bronze. Yet iron is everywhere, not better, but available. And in a world where trade routes have shattered, abundance trumps quality. Rare evidence survives. Fragments of hastily hammered blades, their edges chipped and bent. These were not heirlooms to pass down, they were disposable tools of survival. The Iron Age does not begin as triumph, but as compromise. Tarsus becomes a kind of blueprint for this new world. No longer a node in a grand imperial network, it is a fortress against the unknown. Architecture itself becomes testimony. Splendor can be lost, but survival must endure. But here lies the unspoken cost. When a society builds only to endure, what happens to beauty, to art, to memory? What is the worth of survival without culture? To see how others answered this question, we must turn east, to Babylon, where survival was not carved into stone walls, but enacted in rituals that sought to restore cosmic order itself. The Hittites are gone. Mycenaean palaces are abandoned. Even Egypt staggers. But in Babylon, a king rises whose greatest victory is not measured in territory, but in faith. His name is Nebuchadnezzar I, circa 1120 BCE. His enemy is Shutruk-Nahunte of Elam, a warlord who once stormed into Mesopotamia and committed an act of sacrilege. He seized the statue of Marduk, Babylon's patron god, and carried it east. For Babylonians, this was not just theft, it was cosmic devastation. Without Marduk, the city itself was dislocated from the divine order. Nebuchadnezzar marched on Elam, defeated its armies, and reclaimed the idol. His triumph was not the re-establishment of empire, it was something deeper. Upon Marduk's return, Babylon staged elaborate rituals, re-performing creation itself. Priests recited the Enuma Elish, the Babylonian creation epic, reasserting Marduk's role as the cosmic king who defeated chaos.
What emerges here is a rare truth. The collapse of the Bronze Age forced civilizations to redefine power. No longer could kings promise stability through vast networks of trade and conquest. Instead, they promised survival through meaning. Nebuchadnezzar's greatest act was not rebuilding walls, but rebuilding belief. And this too reflects the transformation of the age. In Tarsus, survival was measured in walls. In Babylon, it was measured in ritual memory. Both were shields, but of different kinds. One against enemies, the other against despair. Yet even these shields could not protect everyone. Beyond Babylon's gates, in the fractured Levant, entirely new identities were forming, born from wandering tribes, seafaring merchants, and displaced peoples. Their rise would not just survive the collapse, it would reshape history itself. Imagine walking into a Cypriot foundry around 1190 BCE. The heat is suffocating, the air heavy with the smell of molten copper. For centuries, this island had been the beating furnace of the Bronze Age. Every empire, Egypt, Hatti, Mycenae, owed part of its strength to the metal that flowed from Cyprus's mountains. Copper ingots, cast in the shape of ox hides, were shipped by the ton. They were currency, lifeblood, power. Without Cyprus, there could be no Bronze Age.
And yet, the archaeological record gives us a moment frozen in silence. At Enkomi, furnaces are found extinguished mid-process. At Kition, bronze axes lie unfinished, their edges still blunt, waiting for the hammer strike that never came. A hoard of oxhide ingots was buried in haste, never reclaimed. Something catastrophic interrupted the work. Not decay over decades, but collapse in an instant. But in the ashes of those workshops, another material begins to surface: iron. At first glance, it seems almost laughable. Early iron blades are brittle, filled with impurities, shattering under pressure. They were no match for a well-forged bronze sword. But iron had one crucial advantage. It was everywhere. Bronze had always been a luxury alloy. Copper from Cyprus, yes, but tin? That came from the ends of the earth. Afghanistan, Cornwall, maybe even Iberia. One snapped trade route, one broken alliance, and bronze became impossible. Iron didn't need distant kings or fragile networks. A village smith could dig it from local soil. It was ugly, it was cheap, but it was independent. Here lies the real revolution, the end of monopoly. Bronze had been the metal of kings locked in palace stores, controlled by bureaucrats, sanctified in temples. Iron broke that chain. A local warlord could arm his followers without waiting for palace rationing. A small community could forge its own plowshares without permission. Iron slipped from the hands of the few into the hands of the many.
And the change wasn't only technological, it was psychological. For centuries, bronze had been wrapped in myth. To wield a bronze blade was to wield the authority of gods and ancestors. To lose bronze was to lose that divine order. Imagine the shock. Kings who had defined themselves as the masters of bronze now stood powerless before villagers with iron knives. But the transition wasn't smooth. For decades, bronze and iron coexisted. In some graves on Cyprus, a bronze dagger lies beside an iron blade, as if the dead hedged their bets. Two metals, two worlds. One dying, one not yet proven. Rarely told is another detail. Cyprus itself preserved the bridge between these worlds. In one destroyed workshop at Enkomi, archaeologists found not only abandoned bronze tools, but the earliest attempts at carburization, the experimental mixing of iron and carbon to make steel. They failed more often than they succeeded, but here we glimpse the future, the first sparks of metallurgy that would dominate for millennia. And yet, the symbolism is unmistakable. Cyprus, the island that had once fed empires, became the graveyard of bronze. Its cities were abandoned, its palaces toppled, its furnaces cold. But from those ashes, iron emerged, not as perfection, but as survival. The Bronze Age had died, but the Iron Age was not just about tools. It was about identities. With old empires erased and metal in new hands, forgotten peoples were about to write themselves into history. Who would they become? Israel? Philistia? Phoenicia? The seeds were already stirring.
The year is 1177 BCE. Egyptian scribes describe waves of desperate peoples battering their shores. Peliset, Danyen, Chequer. Some are turned back, some vanish. But a remnant does something no one expected. They stay. Along the southern Levantine coast, 5 fortified cities rise: Gaza, Ashkelon, Ashdod, Ekron, and Gath. To the Egyptians, these were squatters in lands that still belonged to Pharaoh. To the inland highlands, they were foreigners with strange accents and stranger gods. Archaeology leaves us tantalizing fragments. In Ashkelon, beneath layers of destruction, a cemetery of Philistines has been uncovered. Their DNA tells a story the texts never do. Their ancestors were not Canaanite. They carried genetic signatures from the Aegean world. But within just 2 centuries, that trace vanishes, absorbed into the Levant. A people who had once arrived as outsiders had become locals in record time. Even their religion whispers of blending. Small shrines uncovered at Ekron show altars with both Canaanite and Aegean motifs. Gods like Dagon and Ashtoreth ruled their cults, but the figurines reveal something hybrid, an invented pantheon pieced together from fragments of older worlds.
The Philistines were not simply raiders turned settlers. They were a people caught in identity crisis, who hardened their difference in order to survive. To Israelite chroniclers, they would forever be the enemy. But to archaeology, they are a mirror of collapse itself, fragments of broken worlds recombined into something new. Yet while the Philistines rooted themselves on land, another people chose the opposite path, building not walls, but ships. The northern Levant had been devastated. Ugarit, once a jewel of trade, lay in ash. Its last clay tablets freeze a moment in time, desperate pleas for military aid, unanswered as the city burned. And yet, just south of that ruin, cities like Byblos, Sidon, and Tyre endured. Why them, and not Ugarit? The answer lies in adaptation. These were not kingdoms of chariots and palaces anymore. They became kingdoms without kings. Political power fragmented into city assemblies and merchant elites, flexible enough to survive without imperial armies. From this fragility, they discovered strength. Tyre rebuilt its economy not on conquest, but on specialization. Its purple dye, yes, but more importantly, its maritime intelligence. In a time when land routes were unsafe, Phoenician sailors mapped new sea lanes, hugging coastlines by day, navigating by the stars at night.
And here's the rare truth. Phoenician expansion westward may have begun earlier than the classical sources suggest. Finds at Huelva, Spain, dating to the 9th or even 10th century BCE, show Phoenician presence far beyond the Mediterranean, long before Carthage.
They were not simply traders, they were pioneers of globalization, surviving by spreading risk across oceans. But their strength carried a paradox. Without a central army, the Phoenicians were always vulnerable to greater powers: Egypt in the south, Arameans inland, Assyria rising in the east. Their genius was not independence, but negotiation. They built an empire of harbors, not fortresses, and in doing so laid foundations that others, Greeks, Romans, would later claim as their own. While the Phoenicians mastered the sea, inland communities, highlanders, survivors, tribes, were beginning to write their own legends. Legends not of trade, but of covenant. When the Bronze Age world shattered, what emerged was not silence, it was voices. New voices. Voices that would outlast the ruins of palaces and the fall of kings. They spoke not with the weight of empire, but with the resilience of survival. And in their words, their shrines, their memories, we glimpse the birth of the Iron Age. On the ridges of Canaan's highlands, archaeology reveals something strange in the wake of collapse. Tiny villages, barely a dozen houses, built with stone foundations and simple courtyards. They lacked palaces, they lacked temples, and yet they endured.
One fragment, found at Khirbet el-Rai, shows scribal marks, proof that even among these modest settlements, literacy flickered. At Shiloh, the remains of a cultic center hint at a shared ritual life without a central monarchy. Most striking of all, the complete absence of pig bones in their refuse, setting them apart from their Canaanite neighbors. A silent boundary marker. The Bible will later weave these villages into a grand saga: the Exodus, the conquest of Canaan, the age of Judges. But archaeology whispers a subtler truth. The Israelites did not conquer a land. They emerged within it, reimagining identity in a world where old powers had vanished. And on the Mernukta stele, c. 1207 BCE, an Egyptian scribe etched their name: Israel is laid waste, his seed is no more. The irony is chilling. It is the first time their name appears in history, and it is written as their obituary. Yet the people endured. What Pharaoh declared dead would, in time, give birth to memory, scripture, and legend. But while the Israelites were sowing the seeds of memory, in Anatolia, ghosts of empire clung to life, refusing to surrender the title of Great King.
Hattusa was ash, but the heirs of the Hittite world did not vanish. They reappeared as fractured principalities: Carchemish, Melid, Kumu, Samal. Here, kings still carved lions into their gates, still called themselves Great King, still wrote in Luwian hieroglyphs long after their empire had collapsed. But their confidence was a mask. An inscription of Suppiluliuma II, the last king of Hatti, boasts of naval victories against Elashia, Cyprus. Yet, soon after, the royal archives end in silence. His successors, in Neo-Hittite cities, carved their triumphs in stone, only for their words to be half erased by new raiders and new tongues. In Carchemish, a monument declares, "I am the son of Kuzi-Teshub, great king, hero." Yet we know his dynasty barely held its ground. The Neo-Hittites were not heirs, they were survivors, performing the memory of empire while the world around them no longer cared. And yet their artistry, their hybrid scripts, their stubborn will to proclaim continuity show us something profound. Collapse does not erase identity, it fractures it into fragments. But fragments can outlast the whole. Yet if the Neo-Hittites clung to memory, the next people to rise would master something greater: adaptability.
In the aftermath of collapse,
Deserts ceased to be borders. They became arteries of power. Into the Levant surged the Arameans, desert tribes whose movements were once barely noticed. Suddenly, they appear in force: raiders, settlers, kingdom builders. Unlike the Philistines or Israelites, the Arameans were not tied to a single homeland. They flowed like water, establishing states wherever opportunity appeared: Damascus, Hamath, Bit Adini, Arpad. Their fortresses were modest, their dynasties unstable. Yet their flexibility was their strength. And from this flexibility emerged their greatest weapon, not the sword, but the word. The Arameans spread their language across the Near East. By 800 BCE, Aramaic was replacing Akkadian as the lingua franca. Within centuries, it was spoken from Egypt to Mesopotamia, from Anatolia to Persia. Empires fell, Aramaic endured. Even the Assyrians, who once enslaved the Arameans, later adopted their script. The bitter irony is this: Akkadian, once the language of Hammurabi and Nineveh, died. Egyptian hieroglyphs faded into silence. But Aramaic, born in collapse, survived to become the tongue of prophets, merchants, and even, in Galilee, the daily speech of Jesus of Nazareth. The raiders of the desert ended up shaping the words of the future.
The Israelites, the Neo-Hittites, the Arameans, each tell a story not of annihilation, but of reinvention. Collapse stripped the world of empires, but in the rubble, smaller peoples carved new identities that would echo louder than the ruins of palaces. The lesson is stark. Civilizations may fall, but ideas, languages, and stories can endure, sometimes reshaped, sometimes reborn in unexpected places. The Bronze Age collapse was not just an ending, it was the resetting of history's stage. The board was cleared, new powers would rise: Assyria, Babylon, Israel, Phoenicia. The world was moving into the Iron Age, a world harder, sharper, and less forgiving. And if collapse could birth nations and myths, then what warnings does it carry for us today, in a world just as interconnected, just as fragile?
You've just walked through the ruins of the Bronze Age fire, the silence, the rebirth. But this is only one chapter in a much larger story. Most viewers never see what comes next. They scroll away, they forget, and the echoes of history fade. But you're still here. That means you felt it, the tension, the questions, the warning hidden inside the past. Don't let the next chapter pass you by. Subscribe now. Comment below, which of these survivors, the Israelites, the Neo-Hittites, or the Arameans, do you think changed history the most? Because the next video takes us deeper into iron, empire, and the shadows of a new age. And you'll want to be here when it begins.